Can you see my slides? Thank you, Gary, for nodding. Members of the consortium leadership team. So as Olivia said, this is not a presentation. This is not the official webinar answering questions about the call for proposals. This is about the consortium leadership team offering assistance and identifying itself as a collection of resources for proposal development. And in the chat window, you will see key contacts for each of the organizations that are members of the consortium and people that you can reach out to if you are part of those organizations for assistance or counsel along the way. All of them are listed here. One point of contact for each org is given in the chat window. Other key resources as we move forward are leaders of the CASC. Myself, for example, I'm not a member of the consortium leadership team. We also have a tribal lead for the Midwest Consortium and an engagement lead in Heidi Roop and Mike Dockery. Consortium members also available to be contacted: Olivia Ledee, the USGS director of the CASC, and Kristen Voorhees, the research coordinator, are also available resources as you think about forming proposals and project teams. So I'd like to turn the microphone over to Gary Roloff, who is serving as today's moderator for two speakers and some panel conversation. Gary, I've got this slide here for you, and then I will stop sharing my screen and others can grab the screen to share for themselves.
Excellent. Good. Thank you, Jessica, and good afternoon, everybody. As the previous slide indicated, I serve on the Midwest leadership team of the CASC, and we thought as a group it would be really helpful to provide potential proposal teams some advice on what makes a successful proposal when it comes to meeting the CASC mission. And to that end, what we've done is we've pulled together two formal presentations, and these presenters were instructed to really focus on the elements of their projects that we think resulted in a favorable review by the USGS. And those things included the level of collaboration, the ability to produce actionable science, and then how they effectively managed partnerships to get that science on the ground. The way we have this structured is each speaker will give a formal presentation for about 10 minutes or so. Then we'll have about 10 minutes or so for just a free-flowing question and answer. This is by no stretch of the imagination supposed to be a rigid, structured, kind of scientific presentation. It's more of a discussion. So our first speaker, and these are in no particular order, and I see Dan is on the Zoom screen. So Dan Larkin will be our first presenter. Dan is at least according to the website, Dan, you're an associate professor and extension specialist with Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center. And your areas of interest include aquatic plant management and restoration. Once Dan completes his presentation, I'll turn it over to Ben Zuckerberg, and I saw Ben on the attendance list. I believe he's here. Again, Ben, there you are. Ben's website lists him as an associate professor in forest and wildlife ecology at the University of Wisconsin, and his expertise lies in modern climate change adaptation and habitat loss. And then I also want to give a shout out. I saw Owen. Yep, there's Owen. Owen McKenna also graciously joined us from USGS as an additional panelist to share his perspective on working successfully in the CASC framework. So with that brief introduction and without further ado, Dan, can you take control of the screen and share whatever you have? Looks like it's coming. Yep, you're all set. Looks good.
Okay, great. Thanks, Gary. And thank you for inviting me to present today. I'll be talking about our new CASC project, impacts of climate change on vegetation, eco-hydrology, and management of monoman or wild rice watersheds. And I also want to thank the organizers for sending excellent instructions on what you're looking for in the presentation. So hopefully I've followed the assignment. So our project has two driving questions. How will climate change, forest change, and their interaction affect hydrology of monoman watersheds? And how can adaptive strategies and management actions build resiliency? The star of the show is Monoman and Ojibwe, a variety of other names listed here. I will go back and forth probably between Monoman and wild rice. And I want to acknowledge that this is an important species to other tribes as well. Our partners on this particular project are Ojibwe tribes, and so that's why we use Monoman in our title. Our focus is wild rice. You know, most of what you see on supermarket shelves is cultivated paddy rice, but it's a native species that has wind pollinated flowers that ripen into this nutritious grain that gives it its name. And ecologically, it's an aquatic annual grass that grows on mucky soils in slow flowing lakes and streams, and it needs clear water of stable, shallow depth. And I'm highlighting here a couple of ways in which we're starting to point towards hydrology as being a really critical factor for this species. And this is what we want to see. Wild rice naturally occurs in a good year in these really large, dense expanses that are really harvestable. These are conditions that are ripe for harvest using the traditional methods that continue to be used today. And so you want these large expanses, you want high density, you want filled seed. And this species is of incredible importance culturally, economically, spiritually, nutritionally, in many ways for many people. So I come to this as a plant ecologist, but there are really important human dimensions to this species that I will only touch on in the briefest of ways. Our partners on this project are the 1854 Treaty Authority, an intertribal treaty organization, also Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, which was mentioned on the earlier slides as in terms of this CASC, College of Menominee Nation, another CASC institution, and then the Fond du Lac Band and the Lac du Flambeau Band, two tribes that we're working with closely, including I'll highlight Joe Gravine, who's been a close collaborator on a lot of our work related to wild rice. And then here at the University of Minnesota, my co-investigators are Crystal Eng, who's an eco-hydrologist, and Mike Dockery, who was mentioned as part of the CASC leadership. So I was asked to talk about our project stage, and there's actually multiple answers to that question. It's new as a CASC project. We just began in fall 2022, but this CASC project was really enabled by a broader Monoman collaborative that we're in about the 5th year of, which was enabled by internal funding from University of Minnesota Grand Challenges Initiative and Institute on the Environment, of which Jessica is the director. So that was really crucial for enabling us to be prepared for this type of collaboration and engagement with managers. And what we've been doing over the last 5 years is a tribal university research collaboration that Monoman is at the center of, and then we're looking at various aspects of people and the environment and organisms that interact with this species. And then going back further to prior to me having any involvement in wild rice research, I think this collaborative was enabled by longer term partnerships that started here at the University of Minnesota that were led by others like Diana Dalbotton, pictured here, and Amy Mirbeau, who have had these longer term partnerships that have been very effective and have done things like really engage Native youth in research and provided scientific information that's been relevant to policy and conservation around Monoman. So you can see we're really kind of standing on the shoulders of these earlier partnerships and sort of building from there. In terms of justifying the project, it was one of those happy situations when you read an RFP and you feel like you might have helped write it for the project you want to do. There are ideas that have been kicking around our collaborative that we had heard about from tribal partners that really fit the RFP to a T. In particular, there was this emphasis on coupling freshwater and terrestrial systems under climate change, looking at climate-driven changes in terrestrial systems and their consequences for streams and lakes. And there was an emphasis on projects that were focused on tribal or other lands and really engaged resource managers in a meaningful way. So this really aligned with our sort of broader mission around this research. Continuing on with the justification, why climate change and this species, tribes, Glyphwick, others have really been leaders in climate change vulnerability assessment and adaptation planning. And so we use these and other reports as motivation for our work, and these assessments have consistently found that wild rice is, seems to be unfortunately exceptional in its vulnerability to the effects of climate change. And then thinking about hydrologic vulnerability specifically, this is an assessment from Canada that looked at Great Lakes coastal wetland plant communities. And we see that wild rice, by their assessment, is the species most vulnerable to hydrologic climate change among these 80-some plant species. And then continuing the story and bringing it to land, there's been, not surprisingly to this audience, a lot of vegetation change across the landscape with European colonization, land use change, and other factors. And one of the important consequences of this beyond forest loss is forest change, and that we've seen this long-term landscape scale shift where there's been reduction in conifer cover and increases in deciduous cover. One of many consequences of this is an alteration in the water cycle, a change in the balance between runoff and evapotranspiration that traces back, among other things, to these differences in plant traits, difference in leaf lifespan and function, with conifers generally transpiring more on balance over the year and more stably throughout the year. And so putting this all together in a climate change context, we expect to see an increase in the amount and intensity of precipitation. Evapotranspiration is a massive component of the water cycle, and transpiration is a part driven by plants. So vegetation change could have large effects. And in fact, some estimates have put the shift from conifers to deciduous as leading to up to 2/3 higher runoff. So we expect to see less water pulled out by trees and more runoff to aquatic habitats. So that was sort of the narrative that we wove in our proposal. Another question was about sustained engagement with stakeholders. We were able to quickly respond to the CASC RFP because we had a few years of trust and relationship building behind us, and we had been supported in a number of ways. I mentioned the seed money from University of Minnesota, and also the colleagues who had delivered over a decade plus partnerships with tribes in these really meaningful ways. And then we had also had a chance to demonstrate our commitment to long-term collaboration regardless of the ups and downs of funding cycles. We've put a lot of work, and Mike Dockery, for example, has been instrumental in this, in developing protocols for responsible and accountable research with tribes and making sure that we put into writing the practices we'll follow to be good partners, and that we will abide not only by our own internal research protocols, but also by the wishes of the communities with which we're working. And then I think another thing that's been really valuable for this collaboration is knowledge exchange. So kind of sharing some of the research tools we use with our tribal partners, and in turn, them generously sharing with us cultural practices, for example, how to carve knocking sticks for harvesting rice. I'll just put in a little plug for a paper led by Laura Matson, Crystal Ng, and others that we published last year that was sort of all about the lessons we've learned on being a good partner, and perhaps some of you might find useful in crafting proposal ideas. And I won't go through all of these, but we have sort of a top 10 lessons list that we took away. And I'll just highlight a few in closing. In thinking about working with tribes, the importance of understanding and honoring Indigenous sovereignty and rights, encouraging robust exchange of ideas and being open to sort of true collaboration, and being open to difficult conversations. And also something that was pretty complex institutionally in dealing with the University of Minnesota, in dealing with funding sources, is making plans for identifying and protecting sensitive Indigenous data, which can come into tension around open data laws and the move towards sharing of data in science. And yeah, that's it. Thank you for listening. And it sounds like we'll do sort of Q&A and discussion at the end. So I'll stop sharing, Gary.
Yep, sounds good, Dan. Thank you very much. Very helpful. Anybody have questions specific for Dan before we move on to Ben? We could take a few minutes to answer any of those specific questions if anybody has any, or we can hold them to the end, whatever folks prefer.
I will put a link to that paper in the chat.
Great. One thing that struck me, Dan, as you were presenting, and I'm dealing with it here at MSU, is some of the challenges, and you touched on it at the end of your presentation, are potentially some of the contractual challenges trying to reconcile university desires with tribal desires, and particularly around the intellectual property clause in a lot of our university contracts. So, I point that out as an example, as a location where, or as an item where members of the CASC might be able to help different PIs navigate that. There's some examples of success already. So again, don't feel like you got to tackle this from scratch or do it all on your own. That's why the CASC is here, to try to help you navigate some of those challenges. So, there was one question in the chat. Gretchen asked, can you tell us more about how you handled sensitive data MOU with university and band? So yeah, I think Gretchen's comment there got right at where I was headed as well. So maybe speak a little bit about that, Dan.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so we do have MOUs with some of the tribes we're working with. And then those data issues, and I see Mike is on in the chat, and he was one of the leaders for our project of figuring these things out, but it went to the highest levels of the university, to general counsel, to figure out how we would handle data, because we didn't want to be in the position of having collected data, there being a state data Practices Act request for our data, and then us sharing something that's indigenous data that we, don't have the rights to share. So Mike and others sort of worked through the highest levels of the university to resolve that. It was also an issue. We have funding from NSF as well, and had to deal with it there as well in terms of our data management plan. But it has been through MOUs and us just sort of establishing from the outset that this is special data that needs to come under protection.
Mike, anything to add there, or are you good to move forward?
I would just add that also, and I think Dan mentioned this, but we worked with the tribal councils to get those MOUs. In the end, the university regents weren't the ones that really signed the MOUs. It was us as PIs. It was kind of hard for the institution to I guess sign our own sign our academic freedom away. That's kind of how the lawyers see it. So there's still a need for lawyers and universities to understand how to do this in a good way. And when in doubt, we're just not going to collect any data on university time, money, or computers. Just so there's a very clear separation between things if needed.
Excellent, thank you. Ben, you ready to take it away for your presentation?
Sure. Can you see that okay, Gary? Excellent. Well, great. Yeah, thanks everyone. And thanks Gary and the other organizers for inviting me to come talk to you today. And in speaking with Gary, kind of what I've decided to do was to kind of give an overview of sort of 3 projects that my lab and other collaborators have had funded through climate adaptation science centers. And so rather than sort of drill into one, my sort of gestalt about kind of how it's been developing these projects over the last several years, what's been sort of successful and what have been some of the obstacles. So I'll kind of start off with this. We've got 3 sort of different projects at various points throughout the last several years have been funded by various climate adaptation science centers. And so the first one was assessing the vulnerability of grassland bird populations to climate change. And really with the goal of developing a framework to identify demographic sensitivities and assess the vulnerability of grassland birds to climate change. This was funded, and with a 2-year project, it was funded by the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, and it's been completed. The second project actually kind of developed from that project. It was funded and is funded by the National Climate Adaptation Science Center, really with a focus on strategies for reducing the vulnerability of grassland birds to climate change. This was a little bit more holistic, thinking about creating a synthesis for the vulnerability of grassland ecosystems. We really kind of focused on the central flyway, and I can kind of explain that a little bit more, but again, with an emphasis on grassland birds. And our last project here is on managing and promoting the resilience of winter adapted species to climate change. And the goal here is to determine whether management and adaptation actions can improve the resiliency of certain winter adapted species, namely the snowshoe hare and rough grouse, to climate change impacts. And this is a Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center project that's still in progress. So, I'm going to kind of maybe take a moment here and just sort of reflect on these different projects. Think about kind of overview, what were the justification for them, think about our general approach and what steps we took to achieve our objectives. And then maybe last, think about how we incorporated stakeholders into those different projects. So in terms of our first project, we really did set this up as a justification that grassland birds, sort of as a group of birds in North America, are the fastest declining group. And they've had pretty significant population decline throughout much of the United States and beyond. As a group of species, we tend to think of them as being pretty vulnerable to climate change impacts. And part of the reason is that climate change velocity, the rate of climate change over geographic space, is actually the fastest in grasslands because of their very low-lying flat terrain. And so part of what we really wanted to do with this project in particular was to develop a climate change vulnerability assessment, really dig into a little bit more what is the sensitivity and exposure of grassland birds, in particular a subset of grassland birds, to climate change. So our general approach to this case was creating and advancing a demographically informed species distribution model. And so I think for many of us who are familiar with SDMs, these tend to be primarily based on abundance and occurrence, but we really wanted to incorporate aspects of demography into some of those projections. And so part of our sort of project, our aim here, was to build a conceptual model, develop a demographic database for a subset of species, a select few species, integrate historic and future climate projections, then to actually say where species and population persistence is going to decline in the future. And also, importantly, identify what are the potential mechanisms of their sensitivity, their rainfall, the temperature, the net success of the adult survival, so forth and so on. And so a lot of this relied on doing this meta-analysis of known and published sensitivities and building this demographic model. So right from the get-go, we really knew that we needed to have a very diverse stakeholder group of people who were very familiar with grassland birds and management. And so from the start of the project, we had an initial stakeholder meeting. We had a number of different representatives from both state and federal agencies, as well as NGOs that were involved in some aspect of grassland bird ecology and management. And really, actually, from the get-go, what we wanted to get their input was identifying what candidate species we should focus on. And so this was both in terms of what were species of management concern, but also species that we felt like we had fairly good demographic data to develop some of these fairly data-intensive models. And we also really wanted to work with them to align our model output with sort of the ongoing projects that they had that are being developed on the ground in terms of management and conservation. So we kind of focused on a couple of species, one of them in particular, Henslow sparrow, had a lot of good demographic data. It had implications in terms of management. And so we had a number of different papers that came out that resulted from that work to really try and focus on how these distributions are going to change in the future. So that was a really useful project for me, at least getting started with the climate adaptation science centers, in the sense that we really were able to incorporate stakeholder input from the get-go, from the start of the project. That did sort of dovetail into our next project here. And this was a little bit different, probably less data intensive in terms of modeling. But the overview here and our justification was that grasslands clearly are heavily managed systems, from sort of cattle grazing to burning, clearly agriculture and so forth. And so what there was lacking, at least in terms of our own sort of perspective on this, was how climate change are interacting with some of these other drivers, and whether or not there's any sort of broader consensus as to what are some important climate change adaptation strategies that are either being applied now or can be applied in the future. And again, using sort of grassland birds as those indicator species for being able to develop some of those strategies. So our approach, again, was a bit different. It was less modeling intensive for this case, but we wanted to organize a steering committee of stakeholders that are, again, involved in grassland research and management. We wanted to first identify what they saw as sort of the important and potential climate impacts on grassland systems, and also identify what strategies they are already involved in that could potentially ameliorate some of those effects on grassland birds. We coupled that with this sort of systematic review of the scientific literature as to what's being proposed in sort of the published work and the published universe as to grassland bird adaptation strategies and potential impacts and sensitivities. And then we sort of met with our stakeholders to review those management tactics. So in terms of how we involved them, sort of specifically, we did this, 2-day virtual steering committee meeting. This kind of happened during COVID when we started having a lot of the lockdowns and restrictions. And so we initially envisioned this great sort of, hand-holding exercise where we all got along and got together and face-to-face, but we had to resort to a virtual meeting, which was still great. We had a great representation from the Fish and Wildlife joint ventures, various nonprofit organizations, people that were invested in grassland management and conservation. And so part of what we're hoping to do here as we kind of are at the tail end of this project is to produce this synthesis review, basically also work on developing with NIAX and Stephen Handler a grassland adaptation menu, and that's already sort of in progress right now. And so TNC has been strongly involved in that as well. And in this case, this would be basically a menu of grassland adaptation strategies and options that managers can think about for increasing resilience or resistance of grassland ecosystems and grassland birds to those climate change impacts. The last sort of project here is one that's focused on winter adapted species. And this is really the question of how might a changing winter affect snow and snow adapted species. And our sort of target species here are snowshoe hare and ruffed grouse. They display this very sensitive climate phenotypes from coat color change to morph variation that might lead to these phenotypic mismatches in a snowless background. And we really want to assess whether or not habitat management and translocation might be important or useful approaches for being able to, again, buffer them from these phenotypic mismatches. This was definitely different because we're building on sort of a long-term monitoring project that we've had in place for the last 10 years. It's more of a field-based project. And again, it's a 2-year time horizon. So we're trying to do a lot with this project. But in this case, we're trying to identify those climate vulnerable phenotypes especially with snow cover modeling, be able to look at coat color change and color morphs of grouse geographically throughout the state of Wisconsin, and be able to look at both historic and current phenotypic variation, looking at museum specimen records and so forth. Another important aspect of that is that we are looking at these phenotypes that survived an experimental translocation snowshoe hare that we conducted. And so that's an important aspect from the management perspective. And then whether or not there's certain habitat and forest management practices that might actually be able to buffer these species from these phenotypic mismatches. Again, we've got a really strong sort of group of people and group of agencies from tribal, federal, and state partnerships. We had a symposium on managing winter wildlife at the last TWS symposium a couple of years ago. Glyphwick is involved, Forest Service, and really what we hope to advance is the consideration of phenotypes in management and adaptation. So I kind of sort of broadly say that in terms of these benefits of actionable science, and I'll try to wrap up here, is that, you know, some of my take homes over the last few years is getting that early involvement of stakeholders in idea and the concept design, developing sort of these questions and justifications. And even before developing that grant proposal, you know, really getting that input very early on, I think is important. Trying to have a diversity of stakeholders is not easy. It takes a lot of reaching out. And so, but I think it is important for the success of these projects. Being comfortable with currency beyond publications. So, you know, certainly as a researcher, that's our main goal, but understanding that sometimes a synthesis or data, you know, product is kind of also just as valuable for some agencies. And then really trying to understand that you have to connect science to adaptation within just 2-year time horizons. And that is challenging for a lot of these projects. And so it focuses and may constrain a little bit in terms of how you design these projects and project personnel. Building on established projects and collaborations, just like Dan was saying, I think is really essential. And it certainly played a really important role for us in terms of COVID, when COVID restrictions were happening, that we had a really already established collaborations and relationships with many of our stakeholders. And that was really, really key. And then probably I'd kind of end by, you know, demonstrating a need by really reviewing those priorities. As Dan mentioned, you know, sometimes you read these RFPs, and I think this is, you know, for almost all RFPs, but really being able to connect what it is that you are proposing to some of those general priorities that you'll see coming out through the Midwest CASC. And I've got a little bit more, but I'm actually just going to stop there, Gary, make sure that we can have time to take questions.
This is really good, Ben. Yeah, so maybe we'll have time to come back to your additional content. I do want to allow enough time for Owen to add any advice he may have from a USGS side of things, but any specific questions for Ben before I turn it over to Owen, and then we'll come back to the broader group for broader questions. Not seeing any hands up or anything in the chat. Owen, I'm sorry I'm putting you on the spot here, but I just want to throw it your way to see if you have anything to add or you'd like to, you know, comment on based on what you've heard so far.
Yeah, I think if Ben just puts up his last slide, I'll just repeat each one of those bullets. I think those are, he distilled it brilliantly. Can see why he's been successful in multiple CASC projects. But I guess if I could add any different perspectives, or I guess if there's USGS PIs out there too, yeah, it's I think Dan and Ben really summarized the essence of what I've seen and bought into with the CASCs in terms of co-production and developing these stakeholder networks. And I would say you might be surprised by how willing folks are to collaborate if you bring a decent idea or just bring your attention towards ideas they've already been thinking about for a long time. And as someone who sits usually in North Dakota and thinking about you know, the Prairie Pothole region and the Upper Mississippi River Basin is my link into the boundaries of the Midwest as drawn by the CASC. Just thinking about, you know, being able to translate different research ideas from maybe where you sit into relating to the priorities that CASC has, and yeah, work on those networks. And like I said, some folks might be already pushed to the limit on commitments and things, but a lot of times I got so much great feedback, especially over COVID, from emails and calls and Zoom calls and team calls. And I was really impressed with people's energy and enthusiasm towards these types of collaborations.
Thanks, Owen. And Olivia was wondering, how long have you had some of your partnerships with the Fish and Wildlife Service?
So the core partnerships for the Midwest CASC projects, so those go back probably, I've only been with USGS since 2016. And I think I started branching out from the long-term research sites we have here, where we've been developing some mechanistic models on prairie pothole wetlands. And so Josh Aish with Fish and Wildlife Service and Sarah Vasic, I think I started collaborating with them in maybe 2019. I still haven't met Sarah in person due to COVID, but I met Josh in 2019. And then kind of since then, I've been working with Josh and Sarah in a couple of waterfowl production areas in the Morris Wetland Management District. We've sort of branched out to other state agency partners with Minnesota DNR and four different tribes within the Minnesota River Basin, and then TNC and Ducks Unlimited. And again, that's all been kind of grassroots of networking and TNC hosting things and meeting people virtually. It's been, again, easier than I thought it would be.
Yeah, great, thanks. So I'd like to open it up for broad discussions, and I'll actually kick it off just to get the ball rolling. And especially for early career faculty on the university side, it can be pretty intimidating to try to reach out and form partnerships, right? Effective collaborations. Because I think one of the themes we heard across all the presenters is they've had these long-standing relationships. Trust was built with our tribal partners. It takes a long time to build trust, et cetera. I'm curious from the presenters, what tactics you use to entice partners to be part of a project like the ones you described. Or do you just rely on your established relationships and you like shame people into joining you? Or Dan, you and Ben are both on, all three of you are unmuted. So Dan, why don't you share your thoughts first?
Okay, yeah, good question. I mean, I think for me personally, and this is not, necessarily reproducible, but I've just really leaned on my collaborators, so, Mike Dockery, for example, has, long-standing work with tribes going back to his time at the U.S. Forest Service before he came here. We had great institutional support from the university. So I think, from my experience, it was really a matter of sort of exhibiting that we weren't going to get out over our skis in the research, that we took our time and for the first couple of years really focused on building trust and relationships, and just sort of were patient and let it take its course naturally. And I think by doing that over time, our partners became comfortable. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Mike, but. Gary, you're muted.
Thank you. After 2 years of this, you'd think we'd know how to run Zoom, but I was just, Ben, do you have anything to add to that? I see you're unmuted. Owen, you're unmuted.
No, I think Dan hit it perfectly in a sense. I think it's a matter of trust and respect. And I think, my first bullet point was talking about sort of getting early input into the process. And I think that's really important because I think as opposed to writing up a proposal and then like sending it around frantically and saying, hey, you want to be a stakeholder in this? I think that generally shows that there isn't a tremendous amount of that early input in the process. And I think if you want full investment, I think, again, having those conversations early is a really good way of doing it. In terms of enticement or incentivizing it in any real way, I've always found stakeholders to be excited, frankly. They're already sort of motivated to, I think, oftentimes be part of these conversations. And I think they just want to make sure that their opinions are being heard and integrated into the research as much as possible.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's not like every contract has a million subcontractors, right? Where there's money flowing to all these partners, but it seems based on your presentations, it's more about demonstrating the value of the work you're doing to a broad and wide-ranging group of stakeholders. So, yeah.
I just want to highlight what Ben just said about engaging people early in the process. I think that's such a key statement. And even if you're doing things in the right way, I know at least in terms of working with tribes, you will have been preceded by people who emailed on a Wednesday for something that was due on a Friday and said, this will be so great. Could you please write a letter of support? And so I think for us, part of it was just overcoming that sort of bad history.
I do want to go ahead, Owen. Sorry.
Yeah, I've gotten into the habit of doing things as early as possible, being respectful of some preemptive calls and really explaining the vision, but then also really emphasizing, as both Ben and Dan have said, these products are not the scientists coming in to save the day necessarily, that it is a collaborative effort, and the current project we're bringing together, a big piece of it is going to be a workshop with a number of stakeholders, and I'm strategizing on where that should be. And even though I sit in North Dakota, most of the stakeholders are in Minnesota, so I'm coming to everybody else and trying to just make it as easy as possible in terms of facilitating travel and those sorts of things as well. But even sometimes you give people heads up and they still can't, provide a letter of support. And so figuring out a way that they're still on board and in the know, and they know exactly what it says on the proposals and things like that, I think has helped to keep the trust going as well, for me, at least.
Hey, Gary, this is Jessica. Could you say something about Rebecca's comment in the chat? I know that from the perspective of the CLT, you mentioned a little bit about this earlier.
Yeah, that's the real enigma, right? Is early career faculty new to a region or an institution just do not have the network built. And, I think what you're hearing suggested is to, in that case, try to partner with maybe somebody in the CASC. Again, that's the function that the CASC network should serve, Rebecca, is to help connect you with the partners and the expertise that'll make your proposal competitive. No. Any of the presenters or anybody else have anything to add beyond that comment?
Go ahead.
I was going to call on Craig Packard. Craig, are you on? Do you want to share? Because he's a long-term CASC PI. I said Packard, not Packard. Sorry about that.
Yeah, Olivia, that was mean. I asked a question and you turned it around on me. That I have to
I was like, why are you asking that question that you could answer, Craig?
Yeah, so one thing I'm kind of curious about is just how others produce a product that's useful to stakeholders. And my comment was more linked to, we've evolved from kind of providing data and manuscripts, which we still do, but to more online tools, interactive tools, maybe story maps, which I think is good. But I'm curious if others can speak to what has worked for them? Like, and from my experience, I think these visual tools are really useful. You like a story map, but also the ability, assuming the data can be public, the ability for a user, a stakeholder, to grab the data off of some sort of server or place that they can use it themselves. Because it seems like sometimes what happens is we may develop a product, but we don't know all the uses of that. So then if, say, a stakeholder wants to grab it and use it for something else, they can do that without constantly, say, contacting me or some sort of data manager. But yeah, more in general, I'm just curious on just people's experience on what's kind of the best way to deliver products to stakeholders.
Add a decision support analyst as a co-investigator on your project. I think that again, for this recent round, we're lucky at Northern Prairie to have one of the PIs, Max Post-Vanderberg, who has training in this and has facilitated workshops before. And coincidentally, I got in touch with my Fish and Wildlife Service contacts through one of these collaborative workshops before. So I've sort of seen what's worked, and then yeah, seeing what others have been doing from data releases and things like that of these R-Shiny tools and interactive web apps. And for me, at least, as I'm building that, before over-promising to Olivia that we can do this for the whole Midwest region, is from the way we are doing things from the geographic scale, at least, is starting small and trying to really hone in on what services we want to be able to provide and get that iterative feedback of what the stakeholders really want, and then slowly kind of scale up to hit those large scale sorts of questions.
Well, and just to follow up on that, one challenge that we've had more recently is like with the R-Shiny apps and other tools is how to deliver those. Like, where will those be housed? We've had some situations where we wanted it embedded with the state agency, like servers and data. They're reluctant to do that at this stage. There's some issues with USGS and then even our university as well. So we're kind of stuck in this kind of void of where to put this. That's I guess going to be stable over the years.
Yeah, I think from the questions I've asked and the other folks that I've seen launch these types of things successfully, there's the mechanism to do it within USGS. You just gotta keep asking questions and kind of find the way onto the Amazon Web Services people, and then but maintenance of these things as well is an issue, and I think it's something to be thinking about and a good point to raise.
Yeah, and I want to be sensitive to time. This is really good. I regret not having more time for discussions, and we could always do another one of these sessions too as we near the release of the formal RFP, because USGS will be conducting some webinars and things as well. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Jessica, because I think a lot of us have a hard 2 o'clock stop. But I want to thank the presenters. I know we gave you short notice. Dan, Ben, Owen, thank you for joining us and sharing your materials today. Really appreciate it. So it's all yours, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Gary. And thank you, presenters. We are recording this video. We will make it archive. We're still working on a place to place our archive, but it is available if anyone can also write to me for it directly. In the meantime, I want to flag one thing. We have an open postdoc position. Speaking of best practices, to work as part of the CASC, conducting synthesis research. We'll put in the chat window this link for more information. We're looking for a synthesis researcher, someone to participate with a working group, someone with experience at the interface of social and ecological sciences, especially social science approaches, and this individual will be based at the University of Minnesota. This is the first of 5 postdocs that we will be looking for to pursue synthesis research as part of the Midwest CASC Consortium. And the last thing I'll leave you with is an invitation to our next monthly gathering. If I can get my computer to slide forward, which will be the 4th Monday of next month. My computer's slow. Olivia, I'm tossing it to you to make that.
Yeah, so on, there we go, April
we go.
28th. We're going to be joined by members of our advisory committee, so they can share a little bit more about themselves. So we have, I think it's 12 members representing different federal, state, and tribal agencies in the region. So sharing more about themselves and their organization to give you a little bit of perspective of who we're responsive to and whose needs we're paying close attention to. So that'll be a panel discussion.
Panel discussion. Join us then. In the meantime, if you're thinking of proposals, those consortium leadership team members are key resources, including helping make connections across the network and with potential partners. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.